When I started teaching, I made 3 big mistakes. Now, the mistakes that I made were all very common, and I'm going to talk about them today. So if you are a beginning teacher, perhaps you can avoid making the same mistakes that I did. So let's get to it. So I was about 2 years into my teaching career when I decided to make some really big changes. And the reason is because, after a recital, right? Because a recital is basically a teacher's report card. So when I would watch my own recital of my own students, right? I had about 35 to 40 students. I would see my students come up one right after the other and have the same bad habits, the same technical errors, the same mistakes, the same issues with how they were playing. So I knew, this is very consistent. It's not the students, it's not the parents, it's me. So I need to make big changes, which I did, and that made me a much more effective teacher and definitely made a big difference in the positive for the students. Okay, so the first big mistake that I made was teaching all the students the same way. So a lot of teachers, they get into a rut. They start developing a way of teaching and a way of teaching, their pieces, and they're comfortable with it. And so they just teach the same pieces the same way to all the students. But the thing is all students learn differently. So some students are visual learners, some learn better by hearing, and some learn better by intellectual explanation, right? So the ones who learn most efficiently through seeing, maybe they want to see what they're supposed to do in the music on the music, right? So you can write in, a lot more articulation markings, dynamic markings like diminuendos and crescendos and fortes and pianos and double pianos. You can circle phrases. You can write the phrases in very clearly, circle certain notes. You can write certain words on their piece that might help them. So identifying these kinds of learners, will make it much more efficient. So the other kind of learners, right, would be the listening, right? So a lot of students, and this would probably be the majority of them, learn fastest by listening. So they're pretty easy. I like these kinds of students. They're easy to teach because all I have to do is just play it, right? I just play something for them and they just mimic me, basically. Of course, you want to teach all the different ways of teaching, so you cover all your areas, but if you want to be efficient, then you will prioritize the way that they learn. So of course, like I said, the students who learn best by listening, you just play for them and then they just copy you. Now the other learners are the intellectual ones, right? They like you to explain how to play the piece, right? So perhaps you can tell them a story, like, well, what do you think this piece is about? What is the story? There's no wrong answer. What is your story, right? Or you can paint a picture for them, right? So for example, I don't know, the beginning of the Walton Viola Concerto, I would usually tell my students that it was like this beautiful landscape, right? Maybe it was a beautiful prairie and the sun was coming up and there was a little bit of a mist over the valley. And then as the piece, progressed, as they played one phrase after another, the sun would come up, it would get a little bit warmer, it would get a little bit bigger, right? So being able to have them visualize this picture and the story really helped them be able to play a piece well. So just to summarize, of course, you have these 3 different kinds of learners, generally speaking, and you want to identify what kind of learner they are as soon as possible so you can be the most effective teacher for them. Okay, so the second and probably biggest mistake that I made was not having high standards. And I think the reason why I didn't have high enough standards was probably the same reason why a lot of teachers don't have high enough standards. And that is because you're afraid of frustrating the student too much, right? Especially when they're really young, right? Fix that second finger, or your sound quality is bad, or fix that pinky on your bow, right? They're either too lazy to keep on reminding the student, but more than likely, they just don't want to frustrate the student. But what I found is actually the opposite. If you have high standards, then you set the student up for success in the long run. So if you approach it positively and you do it in the right way, you can have exceptionally high standards for what they're doing, and then this gives them the foundation. So further on down the road, when they have a lot of challenging pieces or whatever it is, it's going to be easier for them to learn, right? So it's actually, you're setting them up to be less frustrated. You're setting them up as a, a higher probability of not quitting of not quitting the piece, of not quitting the instrument. So you want to have really high standards. So more specifically, high standards as far as intonation and setup or technique, and also sound quality. So one of the biggest things that I noticed with my students when I first started is, they had a lot of, right hand issues in their bow hand. A lot of them, and because it's holding the bow properly with a bent pinky and a bent thumb is not, it's counterintuitive, right? So a lot of kids, and nobody wants to do it in the beginning. So a lot of teachers kind of fail to really expect and have high standards. So I started from the very beginning, after I, noticed these things, that, I would stop a student every time they straightened that pinky. I say, oh, bend your pinky, bend your pinky, bend your pinky, right? And they get tired of hearing it after a while. Plus I gave them, exercises and whatnot to help them, right? So I always made sure they're playing their scales and they have a perfect technique when they're playing their scales, and so that every opportunity you can instill the proper technique. And now for pitch, pitch is another one, right? So all of you beginning violin teachers out there know that second finger and fourth finger are the biggest problematic fingers, right? Because with the second finger, right? So you have low second finger and you have high second finger, and this is almost always a problem for especially the little kids. Their high second fingers are too low and their low second fingers are too high, and the fourth fingers are usually too low as well. And a lot of teachers don't insist that these two fingers are absolutely in tune. But it's okay. If you absolutely insist and have extremely high standards, they'll do it. They absolutely will, and they will play in tune. I mean, it was the change in my students was very, very quick, and the next recital I had was dramatically improved. So it doesn't really take that long for the kids to adapt. Now, the other big one is sound quality. Now, this is like a pet peeve of mine, but I never really appreciated how important sound quality is until I started going to competitions with my daughter. So my daughter is a violinist. She's an advanced violinist. She's in junior high school. And she does competitions every year. And so when there's a competition, you sit in a room and there's player after player that comes in and plays. And so where we are, the level is very high. And so the first year, I was shocked though, because there was student after student coming in who had a very high degree of technical prowess. They could play very in tune, they could play just about anything on their instrument. So there's clearly the teachers were good players. They knew how to teach technique. They were very good at it, very efficient at it. And these students were very good pupils, but their sound was horrendous. I mean, just scratchy, right? Or just, really forced, a lot of forced sound. And I was dumbstruck. I mean, because I would sit in the room, and sometimes the teacher was there. So the student would go up and play this incredibly hard concerto or sonata or whatever, it could have been Saint-Saëns or Debussy or Tchaikovsky or Prokofiev or whatever it was, and they would play these really hard pieces, and every note was forced. It was forced or just hackish. It was just nasty. And I would look over at the teacher, because a lot of times the teachers are in the room, and I'm like, you did this. You let this happen. How could you? How could you allow the student to play one note like that? But that is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, for a lot of string teachers, is that they're very good at teaching everything but sound quality. They don't insist. And I think if you asked a teacher, one of these teachers, why do you allow your students to play with bad sound? They probably would say, that they want to focus on the fundamentals first, and they want to wait till the student maybe matures more, and then spend a lot of time on tone production, which I think is a completely insane argument, because do you want a student thinking about their sound for 10 years or thinking about their sound for 3 years? Who's going to have better sound? And so you really, when you instill the absolute necessity for everything that they play on their instrument must sound good, when you instill that at a very young age, they will remember that. They will be their habit. And by the time they're older, they will have amazing sound because it's always something in the back of their head. And even if they're 5, even if they're 4 or 5 years old, they don't have to play Twinkle Twinkle with a hacky, nasty sound. They can play without scratches. All you have to do is insist. And I usually am very positive about it. So if a student plays something, because sometimes I'll get a student from another teacher. I don't teach anymore, but if I get a student, when I used to get students from other teachers and they had bad sound, I would say, oh, wow, you've got really great pitch. Your intonation's wonderful, and I really like how you phrased that phrase. Wow, you must have worked really hard on this, However, what do you think about your sound? And a lot of times they're like, well, bad? And I go, yeah, it was a little scratchy. So why don't we do it again? But this time, no scratches. Let's create a warm sound, right? And let's not force the sound of the instrument. Let's just allow your instrument to ring, right? So as soon as you instill that into them and put that into their library of things that they're practicing, immediately their sound improves. And you know what else improves is their pitch, which I was surprised by. But I found out that when you really, really focus on the quality of sound, the pitch gets better. Why? Because the students are listening much more intently. So anyways, that was a big one, but I've always insisted on good quality sound. But yeah, setup and pitch, you can absolutely have very high standards for it. Even when they're 4, 5, 6 years old, it's perfectly fine. If you do it in a really positive way, it's going to work, and it's going to really pay a lot of dividends in the future. Okay, so the third big mistake, it's not really one that I did, but I thought I'd put it in here because it is really important. So that is using negative reinforcement, right? So a lot of teachers will kind of use some kind of coercive tactics, maybe kind of they're threatening or patronizing or condescending or there's some fear tactics, don't make the teacher mad or whatever. There's a lot of different ways where you can use negative reinforcement. And like I've said in previous videos, negative reinforcement works, but it only works temporarily. Long term, it won't work because eventually the students are going to start to resent you, the parents, and the instrument. So it's a no-win situation for long-term for the student. So a little story. My daughter, who's an my older daughter is an advanced pianist. And when we first moved to another state, she got another teacher who had a lot of students who were winning competitions. And so we checked her out, we auditioned for her, and she took my daughter in. Anyway, she used a lot of negative reinforcement. I mean, my daughter absolutely hated the lessons and just didn't look forward to them, was so happy when she was done. And I mean, it was just, we didn't stay with that teacher for very long. But I stayed with the teacher longer than I perhaps should have because it was a learning opportunity. It was an opportunity for me to kind of learn, what was going on and to see how this teacher was teaching. But it was also a great opportunity for my daughter to learn. She might want to teach in the future, but at the very least, when she gets another teacher, she's going to really appreciate a teacher who teaches properly and uses positive reinforcement instead of negative reinforcement. But what I noticed with this teacher is that, yeah, she had some students who had very good technique, very good musicality, and they could win a lot of competitions, but only when they were young. I noticed after a while that she never had older students. They were constantly being recycled. So these students, once they were old enough, and they had the ability to resent her, resent the instrument, resent the music enough, they would quit. Or they would move on to another teacher, perhaps. I don't know all their stories. But the point is that long term, it was very damaging for this teacher. She could not keep students, and she didn't, as a result, had no advanced students, had no high school students, because they couldn't stand her, even though she had great results, early on. and it's pretty doubtful that she'll ever change the way that she is. But anyway, so negative reinforcement doesn't work. Okay, so I hope I helped you guys out, or if there's any teachers watching these videos, this video is a result of somebody requesting me to do a video, maybe some pointers for young teachers. So here they are. And so if any of you guys have any questions about anything, including this video, please put them down below, because that's how I get ideas, for my videos, so give me some ideas, and I'll, if I can do it, I probably will. I'll put it on the list and boom, I'll knock it out. So as usual, I hope you guys are having a fantastic week, and I'll see you guys next week. And don't forget, happy practicing.